Your daughter says you've been showing signs of cognitive decline, the doctor said, not looking at me as he adjusted the chart in his hands, and in that moment, sitting on the cold vinyl chair in that too-bright hospital room, I realized something far more unsettling than any diagnosis could ever be true. I wasn't losing my mind, I was losing control of the story being told about me, and somehow, my own daughter was the one writing it. A week earlier, everything had still made sense, at least on the surface. I lived alone in the same suburban house my late husband and I had bought over 30 years ago. A quiet neighborhood just outside Columbus, where the mail arrived at exactly 11:15 every morning, and the neighbors still waved when they walked their dogs. My days were simple. I made coffee at 7 a.m., read the paper at the kitchen table, and kept a small notebook where I wrote down reminders, appointments, grocery lists, the kind of things people my age were expected to keep track of. Emily started visiting more often that month. First it felt like concern. She'd show up unannounced, carrying takeout or offering to help organize things. She'd smile, that polished, practiced smile she'd learned somewhere along the way, and say things like, "Mom, you've been forgetting little stuff lately, haven't you?" I would laugh it off. Everyone forgets things. But then it started to feel different. I'd reach for my checkbook and find it in a different drawer. I'd remember paying a bill, only to see a late notice arrive in the mail. Once I stood in the kitchen holding my car keys, certain I had just come back from the grocery store, even though the fridge was nearly empty. Each time Emily had an explanation. "Mom, you told me you moved that. Mom, you said you'd take care of it, but you didn't. Mom, I think you're mixing things up again." She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The calm certainty in her tone did all the work. At a family dinner the following Sunday, she said it out loud for the first time, not just to me but to everyone at the table. "I think Mom might need to see someone," she said gently, placing her hand over mine like she was comforting a child. "She's been confused lately." I remember the silence that followed. The way my sister-in-law avoided my eyes. The way my grandson kept eating like nothing had changed. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because in that moment I wasn't just defending myself. I was trying to prove that I still existed as I remembered myself. And that's a strange thing to have to prove. That night I sat alone in my living room, the house quieter than usual, the ticking clock on the wall louder than I remembered. I opened my notebook and flipped through the pages. My handwriting was steady. My notes were clear. Everything was exactly where it should have been. And yet somehow none of it seemed to matter. Because if enough people believed the version of me that Emily was describing, then that version would become real, whether I agreed with it or not. I closed the notebook and looked around the room I had lived in for decades. Nothing had changed. Not the furniture, not the pictures on the wall, not the faint scent of lavender from the candle I lit every evening. But something else had shifted, something I couldn't touch or point to. The ground beneath me no longer felt solid. And for the first time in my life, I found myself asking a question I never thought I would have to ask. What if the problem wasn't my memory at all? What if it was hers? I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already begun organizing itself around a quiet plan. The house was still dark, the kind of early morning silence that used to feel peaceful but now felt watchful, as if the walls themselves were listening. I moved carefully through my routine, not changing anything that could be noticed. Coffee at 7. Newspaper unfolded at the table. The same chair, the same posture, the same slow sips. If someone were observing me, they would see nothing different. That was important. After breakfast, I walked to the front door and paused before opening it, letting my hand rest on the knob as I listened. There was no sound outside, just the faint hum of a passing car somewhere down the street. I stepped out and checked the mailbox. Inside were the usual envelopes, bills, advertisements, a letter from the insurance company. I brought everything inside and laid it out neatly on the table. I opened each piece slowly, deliberately, as if I were performing a task I had done 1,000 times, which I had. But this time I was not just reading. I was comparing. I was looking for anything that did not belong. It did not take long. There was a statement from my credit card company, one I rarely used, and the balance was higher than I expected. Not dramatically, not enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough to make me pause. I turned to my notebook, the one I kept openly on the table, and flipped to the entries from the past 2 weeks. I had not written down any purchases that matched the amount. I closed that notebook and went to the hallway closet, retrieving the second one, the hidden one, the one that only I knew about. I sat back down and began writing. Date, time, amount, source. No emotion, no interpretation, just facts. That was how I would protect myself. Facts could not be rearranged the way memories could. Around 10 o'clock, the phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice calm and steady. It was Emily. "Good morning, Mom," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. I was thinking of stopping by later just to check in. I smiled even though she could not see it. "That would be nice," I said. "I will be home." There was a brief pause on the line, subtle but noticeable. "Are you sure you are not going anywhere?" she asked. "You mentioned earlier this week you might run some errands." I glanced at my notebook at the line I had written that morning. "Stay home. Observe." "No," I said gently. "I think I will just stay in today." Another pause, shorter this time. "Okay," she said. "I will be there around noon." When I hung up, I sat very still for a moment, letting the conversation settle in my mind. It was not what she said. It was what she needed to confirm. My location. My absence. My predictability. I looked around the house slowly, taking in the familiar details, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had not wanted to admit. This was not random. This was not confusion. This was a pattern. By 11:30 I was ready. I placed my visible notebook on the table, open to a blank page as if I had nothing to hide. The hidden notebook went back into the shoebox in the closet. Then I did something I had not done before. I moved through the house quietly, checking the small things. The position of the kitchen drawers. The angle of the picture frames. The placement of the remote control on the coffee table. I memorized each detail, not perfectly, but enough to notice if something shifted. When the doorbell rang at exactly 12:05, I felt a strange sense of calm. I opened the door and greeted Emily with the same warmth I had always shown her. She stepped inside, carrying nothing this time, her eyes scanning the room in a way that might have seemed casual to anyone else. "Everything looks nice," she said, setting her purse on the counter. I nodded. "It always does," I replied. We moved into the kitchen and she began talking about small things, her work, the weather, a neighbor she had run into earlier. I listened, responding when necessary, but my attention was elsewhere. I watched her hands. I watched where she stood, what she touched, what she did not touch. At one point, she excused herself to use the restroom. I heard her footsteps move down the hallway, pause near the living room, then continue. When she returned, her expression was unchanged, her smile still in place. "You should really think about having someone help you around here," she said casually, leaning against the counter. "It is a lot to manage on your own." I met her eyes and nodded slowly. "Maybe you are right," I said. And in that moment I saw it. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. A flicker of satisfaction. Small. Controlled. But real. I looked down at my coffee cup, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural. Because now I understood something I had not fully grasped before. She was not just telling a story about me. She was building it piece by piece, moment by moment, until there would be no space left for any other version. I lifted my cup and took a slow sip, my hands steady, my thoughts clearer than they had been in days. If she wanted me to play the part she had written, then I would. But I would play it better than she expected. And I would choose the ending. That afternoon after Emily left, I did not rush to check anything right away, and that was the hardest part, because every instinct in me wanted to walk through the house and confirm what I already suspected. But instincts can betray you just as easily as people can. So I stayed exactly where I was, sitting in the same chair, letting the quiet settle again, letting time pass in a way that felt ordinary from the outside. It was not until nearly 2 hours later that I stood up, slow and deliberate, and began to move through the house the same way I had before, only this time I was not memorizing, I was verifying. The first thing I noticed was the living room. The remote control was no longer angled toward the edge of the table the way I had left it. It was straightened, almost perfectly aligned with the corner, as if someone had adjusted it without thinking. I stood there for a moment, looking at something so small it would mean nothing to anyone else, but to me it felt precise, intentional. I walked to the hallway next. The picture frame of my husband and me, the one from our anniversary trip to Maine, had been shifted slightly to the right. Not enough to catch the eye at a glance, but enough that the nail behind it was now visible if you looked closely. I did not touch it. I simply observed. In the kitchen, the drawer where I kept my measuring spoons was not fully closed. It was off by less than an inch, but I always closed it completely. Always. I placed my hand lightly against the wood and pushed it shut, feeling the soft click as it settled into place. My movements were calm, but my thoughts were sharp now, sharper than they had been in years. This was not forgetfulness. This was interference. I returned to the table and opened my notebook, the hidden one, writing down each detail with steady precision. Time. Object. Change. No conclusions, just records. Because I understood something now that I had not understood before. If I reacted too quickly, if I confronted her without proof, I would only confirm the version of me she was presenting. I would become the confused mother, the one who imagined things, the one who could not be trusted. And that was exactly what she needed. The next morning I adjusted my behavior. Not dramatically, not enough to be noticed, but just enough to shift the pattern. I left the house for a short walk around the block, something I had not done in weeks. I did not tell Emily. I did not call anyone. I simply stepped outside, locked the door, and walked slowly, counting each house, each driveway, each familiar detail along the street. It took me 20 minutes to return. When I stepped back inside, the house felt the same at first, but I did not trust first impressions anymore. I moved directly to the cabinet in the living room and opened the drawer where I kept my documents. The folders were not where I had left them. This time the shift was clearer. The bank folder was slightly forward, the insurance papers tucked unevenly behind it. I stood there, holding the edge of the drawer, and let the realization settle completely. She had been here. Not yesterday when I was present, but today when she believed I would not notice. I closed the drawer carefully and walked to the kitchen, where I checked the small details again. The coffee mug I had left in the sink was turned in a different direction. The dish towel was folded more neatly than I ever bothered to fold it. Small things, quiet things, but consistent. I sat down at the table and opened my hidden notebook, writing everything down again, each change, each difference, each moment that could not be explained away. My hand did not shake. My breathing stayed even, because now there was no doubt left. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a concern for my well-being. This was a plan. And plans have structure. They have timing. They have intention. I closed the notebook and rested my hands on the table, looking out the window at the quiet street beyond. A woman walked past with her dog, just as she did every afternoon at 3. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But inside this house everything had. I was no longer trying to understand what was happening to me. I was beginning to understand what was being done to me. And more importantly, I was beginning to understand how to stop it. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not of relief but of clarity. Because the truth, once you see it clearly, does not need to be chased anymore. It waits. And so would I. The next step was not about proving anything to anyone else yet. It was about making sure I could see everything clearly without interference, without confusion, without giving her a chance to reshape what I was beginning to understand. So I changed something small but important, something she would not expect, something she would not notice right away. I went out that afternoon and bought a simple indoor security camera. Nothing complicated, nothing that would draw attention, just a small device designed to sit quietly on a shelf and record what passed in front of it. I paid in cash. I did not mention it to anyone. When I returned home, I placed it in the living room, angled just enough to capture the cabinet where I kept my documents and the hallway that led toward the bedrooms. It blended in easily, tucked between a stack of old books and a decorative clock that had not worked in years. From a distance it looked like nothing at all. That was exactly what I needed. The following day I followed the same pattern as before, but with one subtle change. I left the house again, this time for longer. I drove to the grocery store across town, the one I rarely used, and walked through the aisles slowly, taking my time, choosing items I did not necessarily need, just to create a gap, just to create an opportunity. When I returned home nearly an hour later, I did not rush inside. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front door, letting the stillness settle over me. Then I stepped out and went in as if nothing had changed. The house greeted me with the same quiet as always, but I no longer trusted quiet. I placed the groceries on the counter and moved through the rooms in the same careful way I had learned to do. The details were different again. The drawer slightly open. The frame slightly shifted. The cabinet not quite as I had left it. I did not react. I simply noted it the way I had trained myself to do. Then I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room and picked up my phone, opening the application connected to the camera. My hands were steady, but my heartbeat felt louder than anything in the room. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing but stillness, the empty room, the quiet house, the same familiar space I had lived in for decades. Then, after a few minutes of playback, the front door opened. I leaned slightly closer to the screen, my eyes fixed on the image. Emily stepped inside. She did not call out. She did not hesitate. She closed the door behind her with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. I watched her move through the room, her posture relaxed, her expression focused in a way I had never seen when she was speaking to me. She went straight to the cabinet. No pause. No uncertainty. She opened the drawer and began going through the folders with practiced efficiency, lifting them, scanning them, shifting them, then placing them back in a slightly different order. My breath stayed even, but something inside me settled completely into place. This was not concern. This was access. After a moment, she stepped away and moved into the kitchen. I watched her open the drawer, adjust the contents, then wipe the counter lightly with a paper towel she took from the holder. Small gestures. Careful gestures. As if she was leaving behind a version of the house that would support her story. She returned to the living room, glanced around once more, and then walked out the front door, closing it quietly behind her. The screen went still again. I did not stop the video right away. I let it play for another minute just to feel the silence that followed, just to understand the difference between what the house looked like when I was there and what it became when I was not. Then I set the phone down gently on the desk and sat back in my chair. I did not feel shocked. I did not feel angry. What I felt was something much clearer than that. I felt certain. Every doubt she had tried to plant, every small question she had introduced, every moment she had reshaped, it all fell away in that single quiet recording. I reached for my hidden notebook and wrote down the time, the date, the duration, the sequence of her actions. Not because I needed to convince myself anymore, but because I was preparing for something else now. Something beyond understanding. Something that required more than observation. I closed the notebook and looked around the room. The same room she had just moved through. The same space she believed she controlled. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small shift in perspective. I was no longer reacting to what she was doing. I was beginning to anticipate it. And that meant the story she was building no longer belonged entirely to her. That night I did not review the footage again, not because I did not want to, but because I already knew what it would show, and watching it repeatedly would not change the truth, it would only tempt me to react too soon. And reacting too soon was exactly how I would lose control of what came next. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks in front of me, the one she could see and the one she could not, and I began to do something I had not done before. I compared them line by line. On one side, the version of my life that could be questioned, corrected, dismissed. On the other, the version that could not be altered because it was built on what I had seen, not what I had been told. The difference between the two was not dramatic at first glance. A missing note here. A changed detail there. But when I followed the pattern across several days, it became something else entirely. It became a system. Every time something was moved, there was a corresponding explanation later. Every time money shifted, there was a conversation waiting to reframe it. Every time I hesitated, she was ready to fill the silence with certainty. I closed both notebooks slowly and rested my hands on the table, feeling the weight of something that was no longer confusion, no longer suspicion but clarity. The next step required more than observation. It required preparation. The following morning I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my bank. I did not accuse anyone. I did not mention my daughter. I simply asked for a detailed record of my account activity for the past 6 months, including timestamps and access points. The woman on the phone was polite, efficient, and within a few minutes she confirmed that I could pick up the documents in person that afternoon. The second call was to someone I had not spoken to in years. Daniel Harris had been my husband's financial advisor before he retired, and although we had not stayed in close contact, I remembered him as a careful man, Someone who paid attention to details the way I now needed someone to do. When he answered, his voice was older but still steady. I explained that I had some questions about my accounts, that I wanted a second set of eyes on a few things. I did not say more than that. He did not ask. He simply told me to come by his office the next day. That afternoon I drove to the bank, the same branch I had used for decades, and walked up to the counter with the same calm expression I had practiced over the past few days. When the clerk handed me the printed statements, I thanked her and left without opening them. I waited until I was back home, seated at the table, before I began to read. The numbers told a story I already understood, but seeing it laid out in front of me, in precise columns and dates, made it undeniable. Withdrawals I had not made. Transfers I had not authorized. Patterns that aligned too closely with the times I had been out of the house. I marked each one with a small pencil, not circling them, not drawing attention, just enough to guide my eye. The next day, I took those documents to Daniel's office. It was a small place, quiet, lined with books and framed certificates, the kind of environment where nothing felt rushed. He greeted me with a polite nod and motioned for me to sit. I handed him the papers without explanation. He read them carefully, his eyes moving slowly across the pages, his expression neutral. When he finished, he set them down and looked at me directly. "These are not random," he said. "Who else has access to your accounts?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "My daughter," I said. He nodded once, not surprised, not judgmental, just acknowledging the fact. "You need to limit that access immediately," he said. "And you should consider documenting everything." I almost smiled at that, just slightly, because that part was already done. When I returned home, the house felt the same as it always did, but I no longer saw it as a place where things happened to me. I saw it as a place where I could control what happened next. I sat down in the living room, picked up my phone, and opened the camera application again, not to watch the past but to confirm the present. The room was empty, still, exactly as I had left it. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligned. And when things align like that, there is only one question left to answer. Not what is happening, but when to reveal it. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of focus, letting the plan take shape in a way that felt calm, controlled, inevitable. Because whatever story she believed she was building, it was about to reach a point where it could no longer hold. And when that happened, I would be ready. By the time the next weekend approached, I had already decided that waiting any longer would not give me more clarity, it would only give her more time, and time was the one thing I could no longer afford to give away. The plan had formed slowly, not in a single moment, but through a series of quiet realizations, each one settling into place until there was nothing left uncertain about what needed to happen next. I would not confront her alone. I would not accuse her in private where words could be reshaped and denied. If the story she had been building relied on an audience, then the truth would need one too. I picked up the phone on Thursday morning and made a series of calls, keeping my tone light, my words simple, as if I were arranging nothing more than a small family gathering. I invited my sister, my nephew, a close neighbor who had known me for years, and even Emily herself. "Just a little lunch," I said. "It has been a while since we were all together." No one questioned it. There was comfort in routine, and I had always been the one to bring people together. That had not changed. When I called Emily, she sounded pleased, almost relieved. "That is a great idea, Mom," she said. "It will be good for you to have everyone around." I could hear it in her voice, that quiet confidence, that sense that everything was unfolding exactly as she expected. I smiled as I held the phone to my ear. "Yes," I said softly. "I think it will be." The morning of the lunch, I moved through the house with careful intention, preparing everything the way I always had, setting the table, arranging the plates, placing the napkins just so. There was nothing unusual about any of it. That was the point. The house needed to feel the same, to look the same, to give no indication that anything had shifted beneath the surface. But behind that normalcy, everything was ready. The documents from the bank were organized neatly in a folder, the dates marked with small, precise notes. The recording from the camera was saved, copied, and backed up in a way that could not be erased with a single action. My hidden notebook sat inside the drawer within reach, its pages filled with days of careful observation. I was not improvising anymore. I was prepared. When the doorbell rang just after noon, I felt a calm settle over me that surprised even myself. One by one they arrived, greeting me with the same warmth they always had, stepping into the house as if this were just another ordinary day. My sister hugged me tightly. My neighbor commented on how nice everything looked. My nephew asked about the weather, about small things that filled the space with normal conversation. Emily arrived last. She stepped inside with that same composed expression, her eyes moving briefly across the room, taking in the details, measuring the environment the way she always did. "Everything looks beautiful, Mom," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I nodded. "Thank you," I replied. We gathered around the table, the plates filled, the conversation flowing. Easily at first, light topics, shared memories, the kind of exchange that makes everything feel intact. I listened, responding when needed, but my focus was not on the words. It was on the rhythm, the timing, the moment when everything would shift. It happened sooner than I expected. My sister asked a simple question, something about how I had been feeling lately, and before I could answer, Emily spoke. "She has been a little confused," she said gently, her tone carrying just enough concern to sound sincere. "I have been keeping an eye on things." The words settled into the room, soft but deliberate, and I could feel the attention turn toward me, the subtle shift in posture, the quiet reassessment that happens when someone introduces doubt. I placed my fork down carefully and looked at her, not with anger, not with surprise, but with something steadier. "Have you?" I said quietly. Emily met my gaze, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she replied. "I just want to make sure you are okay." I nodded once, as if considering her words, as if weighing them. Then I reached for the folder beside me, the one that had been waiting all morning. I did not open it yet. I simply placed my hand on top of it, letting the gesture speak before the words did. Around the table, the conversation had stopped completely now. The room felt different, the air heavier, the quiet more focused. I looked from one face to another, taking in the people who had come expecting a simple meal, not realizing they were about to witness something else entirely. Then I turned back to Emily, my voice calm, my posture steady, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Because this was the moment where the story would change. Not slowly, not quietly, but completely. I did not rush the moment because rushing would have turned it into something emotional, something uncertain, and I had not come this far to lose control now, so I let the silence sit at the table for a few seconds longer than anyone expected. Long enough for every pair of eyes to settle, long enough for Emily's words to linger just slightly unchallenged, as if they might be accepted if I did not respond. Then I opened the folder. The sound of the paper shifting was quiet, but in that room it carried weight. I lifted the first document and placed it in the center of the table, turning it so everyone could see. "These are my bank statements from the last 6 months," I said, my voice steady, even the way I had practiced in my mind. No anger. No accusation. Just facts. Emily did not move at first. She kept her expression composed, but I saw the smallest change in her eyes, not fear, not yet, but attention. That was enough. I slid the next page forward, tapping lightly on a line I had marked earlier. "Withdrawals," I continued. "Multiple. All made when I was not at the bank." My sister leaned forward slightly, her brow tightening as she looked down at the numbers. My neighbor adjusted her glasses, scanning the page with quiet focus. No one spoke. I reached for my phone and placed it beside the documents, the screen already prepared. "And this," I said, "is from inside this house." I pressed play. The video began without sound, just the image of the living room, still and familiar. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then the door opened. I did not look at the screen. I looked at Emily. Her posture remained upright, but her shoulders had shifted just slightly, the way someone adjusts when the ground beneath them changes without warning. Around the table I could feel the attention pulling away from me and toward the unfolding image, the quiet recognition that something real was being shown, something that could not be explained away with words alone. I let the video play just long enough for her to be seen opening the cabinet, moving through the folders, touching what did not belong to her. Then I stopped it. Silence again. But this time it was different. It was not uncertain. It was focused. I folded my hands on the table and spoke softly. I have been told for weeks that I am forgetting things, I said. That I am confused. That I need help. I paused, not for effect, but to let the words settle into the same space she had filled so easily before. But I am not confused, I continued. I have been watching. Emily finally moved then. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would draw attention to itself. She straightened slightly, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came immediately. That was something I had never seen before. She always had words. Always had an explanation ready. I gave her the space to find one because I wanted everyone else to see that moment, the absence of certainty where it had always existed before. Mom, she said finally, her voice softer now, less certain. You are misunderstanding what you saw. I nodded once as if I had expected that. Then help me understand, I replied calmly. Why are you in my house when I am not here? She hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. My sister looked up from the papers, her expression no longer neutral. My neighbor shifted in her seat. The room had changed. Not because I had raised my voice or demanded anything, but because the structure she had built was no longer holding. I reached into the drawer beside me and took out the notebook, the hidden one, placing it gently on the table. I wrote everything down, I said. Every time something moved. Every time money disappeared. Every time I was told I had forgotten. I did not open it. I did not need to. Its presence was enough. Emily looked at it, then at me, and for the first time since this began, I saw something break through the surface she had maintained so carefully. Not anger. Not denial. Something closer to realization. The story she had been telling was no longer the only one in the room. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my voice steady as I spoke again. I trusted you, I said. That is what made this work for you. I did not say anything more. I did not need to, because in that moment the truth was no longer something I had to defend. It was something they could all see. No one spoke immediately after that, and the silence that settled over the table was not the kind that comes from confusion. It was the kind that comes from understanding, the kind that forces people to rearrange what they thought they knew into something that finally makes sense. My sister was the first to move. She reached for the papers again, slower this time, reading more carefully, her expression tightening with each line she followed. My neighbor leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes shifting from the documents to Emily and then back to me, as if she was measuring something that had quietly changed shape. Emily remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, but there was a tension in them now, a stillness that no longer looked controlled but held. This is not what it looks like, she said finally, her voice lower, less certain than before. I did not interrupt her. I did not correct her. I simply waited, the way I had learned to do, because explanations reveal more than silence ever can. She glanced around the table, searching for something, for support, for a place to anchor her words. I was just trying to help, she continued. Mom has been forgetting things. I thought it would be easier if I handled some of it. My sister looked up sharply at that, her eyes narrowing slightly. Handling it without telling her? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if the next sentence had not yet formed. I watched her carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a clarity that had taken weeks to reach. This was the moment where everything she had constructed had to stand on its own, without my confusion to support it. You told people I was losing my memory, I said quietly. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second something familiar flickered there, something that almost resembled the daughter I remembered, but it passed quickly, replaced by something else, something more distant. I was worried about you, she said. I nodded once, accepting the words without agreeing to them. Then why did you not ask me? I asked. There was no sharpness in my tone, no accusation, just a question placed plainly on the table between us. She did not answer right away. And in that pause, everything that needed to be understood became clear to everyone else in the room. My neighbor exhaled softly, shaking her head just slightly, as if she had come to a conclusion she did not want to reach but could not ignore. My nephew shifted in his seat, his posture no longer relaxed, his attention fixed entirely on Emily now. The balance had changed. Not because I had forced it, but because the truth had been allowed to unfold in its own time. I reached forward and closed the folder gently, not to hide anything, but because there was nothing left that needed to be shown. The evidence had done its work. I rested my hands on the table and looked at Emily one last time, not searching for an explanation anymore, not expecting one. "I am not confused," I said, my voice steady, quiet, final. "And I am not someone you get to manage." The words did not need to be louder than that. They did not need to carry anger. They only needed to be clear. Emily looked down at the table then, her gaze settling on the closed folder, the phone, the notebook, the pieces she had not expected to be there. For a long moment she said nothing. And that silence, more than anything else, confirmed what had already been seen. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the moment had reached its end. The others remained seated, their eyes following me as I moved to the kitchen, picking up the coffee pot and returning to the table as if this were still a gathering, as if the structure of the day still held. Because in a way it did. Life does not stop when the truth is revealed. It shifts. It adjusts. Continues, but differently. I poured a cup for my sister, then for my neighbor, my movements steady, familiar, grounded in the same routine that had never left me. When I returned to my seat, the room felt quieter, but not heavy anymore. Clear. That was the only word for it. Clear in a way that left no space for doubt, no room for someone else to define who I was or what I understood. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes briefly, acknowledging the moment without needing to explain it further. Then I reached for my cup, lifting it carefully, the warmth steady in my hands. For weeks I had been told I was losing something. My memory, my clarity, my sense of reality. But sitting there in that quiet room with everything laid out exactly as it was, I understood the truth more clearly than I ever had before. I had not been losing my mind. I had been watching it be rewritten. And now finally I had taken it back.